Welcome into this new podcast episode. Today I'm talking to Della and Duncan. Welcome, Della.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. I was hesitant to ask you, but at some point I just put myself to it and asked you and said yes. So that's really great. So thank you. I'm really happy with that. And I've been listening to a lot of episodes, classes of you. So sometimes when I do that, it's very difficult. Where do I start asking questions? What I already all know. So is there something that you want to start off sharing that you think is that you really want to share because what you've done today or yesterday, or you think, oh, this is really interesting that what I learned.
Well, maybe I'll share since for those listening in the video form, hello, we won't be doing an intro. One way I like to introduce myself is what are the plants in my current regenerative livelihood garden? Just because I like to introduce that theme and an offering for anyone listening, but also by way of introduction of what are the plants or the offerings that I'm currently working with. So I would say that the title of my regenerative livelihood garden is Renegade Economist, and the deeper, more mythopoetic title is like one who supports remembering to ourselves, to what's important to us, to each other, and to the web of life. And then the plants that I'm currently cultivating or supporting is co-founding the California Donut Economics Coalition. And I also mention these because perhaps they may be topics we'll discuss, but bringing donut economics to California, which is where I'm based, serving as a right livelihood coach, which I know connects with your work as a business coach. So, supporting folks to find aligned work in the realm of Buddhist economics, kind of taking our spirituality off the cushion into our work spaces, but also transforming the nature of work as well. Hosting the Upstream podcast with Robert Raymond on alternative economics and political economy, and teaching and consulting alternative, post-capitalist business models. But I'll also say that I am a caretaker to my mom, who is an elder, and also I'm due to have a baby in May. So I just include that as, our parenting, our caretaking can also be offerings of our time. So I also share that as well. And then I do work with Dr. Fritjof Capra, teaching a course on the systems view of life. So that's another point of connection. But yeah, those are some of the plants, some of the ways that I'm offering in the world by way of introduction. And as I share them, I invite folks to explore what is your livelihood garden right now, and how do you cultivate your soil, your self-care, your resilience, and how might this conversation serve your gardening of your livelihood garden? Maybe there's something that you might hear from the two of us that might inspire a new way of gardening or a new plant.
I love that idea of the garden and as humans being part of nature, but also taking care of nature, right? So it's not
Mm.
just accepting that it is there, but also taking care of it. Because I think been reading a lot about that lately about how important it is that we take care of nature and we do work in nature. It's not just seeing it grow and just letting it be, but also really participate in this. Yeah, you talked about so many things where I think we can go. The Okay, let's Renegade. That's a title that not a lot of people carry. I looked it up, but what does it mean to you?
Hmm. Well, I first heard the title given to Kate Rayworth, the founder of Doughnut Economics. She was called a renegade economist. And if you're familiar with her work, one of the things she does is really ask, what is economics of the 21st century? And she gives us these things that we need to unlearn and these 7 ways that we need to cultivate being a 21st century economist. And so for me to be a renegade economist is to challenge and unlearn the paradigms and values that underpin mainstream economic thinking. I've just found that a lot of the challenges of our time, when we go upstream to the root causes, it's what we've been taught about who we are as humans, about our relationship with each other, about our relationship with nature, and they're very indoctrinated in mainstream economic thinking. So to expose them, to challenge them, and to unlearn them, and then to also seek the alternatives is part of what it means to be a renegade economist. And I would say that although, as you said, there's not many people who really call themselves that, I would say there's more and more. And also there's folks who I would say are renegade economists, even though they may not, say that they are that, because there's so many people who are doing this work right now, who are just challenging mainstream economic thinking, who are asking big questions of economics, and who are really cultivating alternatives all around the world.
Yeah, and I think challenging the economics, and I think you have to already be fairly confident, or at least have some feeling that the current economic system is not working. Well, you do, but a lot of people still, I think, are struggling with this idea. They want to hold on to this old way of working because, it's giving us security, it's giving us like a paycheck and money and everything. Um, how do you talk to people who still believes that the current economic system, like the capitalism, isn't the right thing, isn't right for us at this moment?
Mm. Well, one thing I would invite folks to look at is what are your indicators or your metrics? Like, how are you defining success, right? So, you are right that some might say, oh, the economy is doing well, or our economy is doing well in comparison with another economy. I would say, how so? Like, what do you mean by doing well? What is progress? What is development? And when we look at that in a mainstream economic lens, we find that it's very tied to growth and growth of GDP, gross domestic product, which is just total exchange of goods and services without any kind of moral kind of question as to what those are. But also on the individual level, it's growth of income or wealth. And on a business level, it's growth of profit. So it's kind of those threefold, depending on which scale you're looking at. And so, yes, you're right that some might say the economy is doing well, or this economy is doing well by those indicators. But what I would ask is, what is truly important to you? And what is truly important to us? There's a beautiful Buddhist proverb that is, the most important thing is to know what is the most important thing. And I know that when I ask myself that, and when I ask folks that I work with that, they don't say more money or money, like tons of money. They say things like happiness, health, well-being, community, connection, thriving, right? That's not to say money doesn't serve that. And if we're below a certain line of income or of, enoughness, then more money does equal more happiness. This is part of Daniel Kahneman. He has this curve that shows that money and happiness are actually correlated until a certain amount and then it plateaus. So I'm not saying money doesn't have any connection, but it's more money is a means to an end, and the end is actually something more like happiness or well-being or health. That's on the individual level. And then when we take that to the collective, it's the same thing where it's like, what's most important to us? It's like to be a good ancestor, to leave the world better than we found it, to live in right relation with the more than human world, to feel connectedness with our neighbors or our communities or those who will come after us or our ancestors before us. So when we think about that and we look at how is the economy serving that, we actually find, wow, we actually have pretty high levels of inequality socially, and it's growing. We have so many people whose basic needs are not met, so they don't have the ability to be happy, healthy, and well, right? And we have actually a lot of harm that our economies are causing to the more than human world, to our waters, our mountains, our ecosystems, the climate. So, yeah, when we look at it that way, we actually say, whoa, the economy is not serving human and planetary health and well-being. And that can be an entry point to, okay, why is it? Why is it that capitalism or the growth industrial society is causing all this harm. And again, we can go into the assumptions underlying mainstream economic thinking, the mechanisms of capitalism, the operating principles, the operating values. And then from there, we can ask, what are the alternatives? And we can imagine them and envision them, but we can also find them in reality, existing reality in the past and in the present. Because there are people all around the world who are doing housing differently, doing food differently, doing healthcare differently, doing allocation of resources differently, doing business differently. So it doesn't have to be totally new. We don't have to look very far, but we do need to ask these questions and then point to and uplift the alternatives.
The um, you are in California, in the U.S., where the statement has been said that the true uh, point of a business is to make profit. So profit is the most important thing for a company to accomplish. You are bringing donut economy to California. I would say the area for large tech companies to prosper, to grow as large as they can, and to create like dominance in like a sector, like a plateau, platform, whatever. How do you how do you bring people along on this journey to see? And I know you explained what you just did with what's going bad in today's economy or world and planet, everything. But still, these people think, these people, that's not what I'm trying to say. Because that makes me them and us. That's not what I'm looking for. How do you bring the people along that have this different feeling about, we need to grow as big as we need to be the number one in our industry or in our area, in our platform?
Mhm. So I've had the really good fortune of getting to study with and be mentored by Jennifer Hinton, Dr. Jennifer Hinton, who I know you've had on your show, who has a beautiful vision for a post-profit world, a not-for-profit world model. And in her work, I just want to like point to her work. She really shows that one of those like upstream challenges of our time, root causes, is the profit motive and mechanism. So it's the fact that we want more and more and bigger and better all the time, that like internal feeling, that profit motive, but it's also the mechanism in a system-wide analysis that it is the profit mechanism that is creating increasing and extreme wealth inequality. It's causing wealth consolidation and corporate takeover. It's causing climate change and all sorts of other challenges. Like she shows on a systems map how this happens, like why this happens. So what I would challenge that idea. I mean, of course, the point of a business is to make a lot of profit. That is true if it's a capitalist business, but I would challenge that as, is that really what we'd want? And I would actually invite people who are entrepreneurial. I would not stigmatize or demonize people who are an entrepreneurial spirit, but instead I would say, awesome that you have this drive, this sense of hustle, this commitment to business and to, whatever your offering is. What do you want it to serve? What do you want your entrepreneurship to serve? What cause or issue? And there's plenty, right? So I think entrepreneurship can be a force for good. How? Well, you would have a not-for-profit business that Jennifer Hinton offers. So you would have some sale of goods and services, such as a restaurant, right, that serves, local, sustainable meals that are just delicious and fun, and you bring live music, right? Like that's your offering, that's what you're selling. You pay your employees well. You have ethical, local, sustainable supply chains, but you find enoughness, right? What is enough for you to make? Again, going back to that Kahneman curve, like what's that enoughness? You find that enoughness, and then after that, which is called profit, Where do you want that profit to go? Sometimes you need to redirect it into the business if you need like rainy day funds or invest like to fix up certain your stove or things like that. But if you really have a ton of excess, I really want to consider that's possible, then direct that profit towards mission-driven work. Do you want to support the fact that there's so many homeless people in your town? Do you want to help do cleanups, right? Do you want to support the water and the fish, right? Populations or the pollinators, right? Or people of color or the global south. I mean, there's so many issues. So great that you have a business, great that you have entrepreneurial service. What do you want it to serve? And there are business models like the not-for-profit business that allow you to have enoughness and serve your function, your business function, but redirect that profit to where we need it right now today.
Yeah, one of those business setups would be like steward ownership, right? So that you could use steward ownership to make sure that as a owner, as a founder, you're not in, you know, at some point maybe feel the need or the want to sell your company because somebody's offering you a lot of money, right? Because if you have like a steward-owned company, you can't sell it because it's part of the stewardship. You cannot make the decision anymore. I like that part, and the sooner you make that decision, I think the better it is. Because if it grows too large and people come with it like a huge bag of money, I think many people will still be very hesitant not to take that money. And I can understand that, of course, but I also hate that idea, because I think if you have that much money, then again, what we're doing is extracting that money from the business where it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be with you as the founder, because everybody in the company has built the company with you, and so it should not just be your money. And I like that idea of having, okay, what is it that what you need to do? What is it really that your mission is as a company? But also, if you really are making a lot of profits, how could you use that, like in the common world with others, and with nature, and people who really would need these ideas or attention, or knowledge of you, whatever you can offer them. And also, to bring that back to how you started off, was with the idea of that you say you take care of your mom, right? So yes, you are a woman, so it's, for most people, it's very logical that you take care of your mom. But I think in general, as humans, this is part of what we do, right? You can make it part of what you do. You are not. There's no law that says you would need to work like 40 or 60 hours a week, and you have no time to spend time with your relatives or taking care of somebody that you really love. And I think if we could just normalize that a little bit more, like you do. That's why I've invited you, because I want to normalize this a little bit more than we have now. Is that we understand that enoughness is really important for us, because then if we have enough, if all of us have enough, we can thrive as humans, as individuals, and we have probably time enough to take care of our relatives or people or neighbors or whoever we think is important to take care of. So I really think if you didn't see that, yes, as a listener, that connection, I think that's really important to understand, that you can spend a part of your time not just working because you want to make more money, but because you want to have like a good life, and afterwards you can say, I'm not regretting this part of my life because I really had the time and space to take care of someone. So thank you for, well, first of all, doing that, and secondly, just bringing that up as a part of your garden. You mentioned, I think you mentioned it. Maybe I've heard it in another episode, but I think you mentioned it was the Buddhist economy. And I know that you've had a lot of to do with the work by A.F. Schumacher. Schumacher. Why is this? Why does this sound so good to you, the Buddhist economy?
Well, Buddhist economics was one of my initial kind of inspirations or directions to this work. So I came to mindfulness very like self-focused mindfulness, what Ron Purser would call Mick mindfulness, very like
Mick?
self-focused. Mick mindfulness, like McDonald's.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, meaning very self-focused and for like personal alleviation of suffering, right? And then, due to more engaged spiritual teachers or engaged Buddhist teachers, like Thich Nhat Hanh or Joanna Macy, I was kicked off the cushion into a path of engaged activism. And I moved from mindfulness, mindfulness spirituality for personal benefit, to mindfulness spirituality for collective liberation. Okay. And in that process, I was also questioning mainstream economic thinking and really trying to figure out what is causing the challenges of our time: inequality, homelessness, climate change. And I was on a walk with a Buddhist nun from Korea, and I turned to her and I said, what about Buddhist economics? Like, what if we connected the ethics and principles and values of Buddhism with economics? And she said, have you heard of E.F. Schumacher? So, I thought I was having a novel idea, but she was like, there's been people who've looked at this. And of course, so many people who've looked at this, including E.F. Schumacher, which, just to introduce him, so he was a mainstream economist, development economist, who went to Burma, and he was meant to kind of help with mainstream development, that kind of progress that we articulated earlier. And instead, he was very touched by the Buddhist culture there, and he found that people were trying to be happy with less and less. And the influence of Buddhist values on him led him to say, whoa, he led him to challenge everything he knew about mainstream economic thinking, and for him to become a renegade economist. And he famously wrote and published the book Small is Beautiful: Economics as if People Mattered, with a chapter called Buddhist Economics. So that's what led me to Schumacher College, named after E.F. Schumacher. And it's founded by Satish Kumar, who is very much connected with Buddhism, as well as Jain spirituality and Hinduism. But just that idea of connecting spirituality, particularly eco-spirituality, liberation spirituality, with economics is kind of where I got that connection. But I will say that since then, I've also gotten connected with the gross national happiness movement in Bhutan, which is similar to donut economics in the way that it really attempts to change the goal of the economy. Again, from growth, right? Just blind GDP growth as good in itself and as the end goal, to a holistic sense of happiness and well-being for people on the planet, gross national happiness, as well as this idea of right livelihood. So right livelihood, again, is one of the Eightfold Noble Path in Buddhism. And for me, it's really, how do we take our mindfulness practice, our compassion practice, our spirituality off of our cushions and into our daily lives? Because part of that mindfulness is that it can be kind of a bifurcation. There's like our spiritual practice, our spiritual selves, and then we might go to work in a totally extractive or
Mm.
exploitative space. And that's not to shame people who do that, because so much of our system is set up for those kind of jobs to exist. But right livelihood is a questioning of that, and a real attempt to better align our values with our work in the world. And also, as I said, change the nature of work for all people.
Yeah, for the people listening, I will put the episode of the for the Dutch people because it's in Dutch. I have to remember that. We did an episode on Small is Beautiful in the book
Hmm.
podcast. I will put the link in there. If you're Dutch, you can listen to that too. And I also really liked the episode on Buddhist economics. So that was for me, it was very interesting. And the person who I'm recording this always with, he's an historian, but also economist. So it's really interesting to have these conversations with him and learning from the past, and also learning how this changes the world, how this is really influencing us. And this small is beautiful, enoughness. It's a topic that's been, I think, on my journey for, I don't know, 3 centuries now. I'm not sure, but for a long time. And I'm very on this issue. I'm very different than a lot of people because I'm very happy with enough. And it's very difficult for other people to understand that because they believe that you always need to have like more and more and more. Even if you have like a podcast that you want to go to the next step, maybe you want to go to the radio and become like more publicly known on as a radio host. Well, I don't need to do that. I love my podcast. I love having these conversations in a time that I can spend and having these conversations without having advertising somewhere in between because the radio show needs that advertising. I don't want that part. So enoughness is a really I really understand and live that idea, even though it's I have this huge world around me, which sometimes makes it difficult too. Um, how do you start introducing and implementing the donut economy into your area in California?
Mhm. Yes. So if we're going back to this idea of challenging mainstream economic thinking and this idea that the goal of the economy is growth of GDP, then one thing we'll do is we'll find all the places and movements around the world that are challenging that and offering an alternative. I mentioned gross national happiness, for example. I'll also mention the economy for the common good in Austria. We have in Wales the Well-being of Future Generations Act. We have Buen Vivir in Latin and South America, roughly translates to the good life or living well. And so it's all over the world. There's also Happy City Bristol, right? So many different models. Donut economics is one of them. And it is actually one that a lot of people find connection with. And that's partially because there's an image connected with donut economics. And Kate Rayworth, who's the root teacher and person offering donut economics, she really speaks to why having an image and changing what is the image people think of when they think of economics from this supply and demand curve to the donut, why that is such a powerful tool. So, donut economics, yeah, led by Kate Rayworth, but I will say it is really a global movement, and there's something called the Donut Economics Action Lab, which anyone can join. It's a free community, and the amount of pilots and projects and endeavors that pop up are incredible. They're just every day there's new ones. So I really encourage folks to just check that out and check out that map because you might actually find that there might be a donut economics initiative near you. And if there's not, you might start one. So what we decided in California was to just start gathering people interested in donut economics to talk about what donut economics might mean for California. How might we bring this to life here? And how we brought it to life, one way was to create a snapshot of California. So, a portrait of California's economy in relation to the donut. You can also think of it as like a health report,
Hmm.
right? And so, in the center of the donut hole, you have how well is the economy meeting the human needs? And the initial offerings of those are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So let's take California. How is California doing at meeting the human needs for access to clean, safe, quality water, healthcare needs, education needs, political voice, equality, etc. And then the outer ring of the donut are the needs of our ecosystems or the planet. And those come from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And those are the planetary boundaries. And it means that our planet, our ecosystems, can withstand some pressure or change, some fluctuation. But if we go beyond certain points, it's very harmful and dangerous to our ecologies, and it can tip our planet into alternate states. So, on the global level, it's things like ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, carbon emissions. But if you took a local level, like California, you would ask, what are these indicators, but for our state level? So you'd consider that. And so that's the first thing we did was map how is California doing at meeting the human needs of our people in California? And then how are we doing at staying within the boundaries or the needs of our ecosystem? And bad news, we are 100% under in all social indicators and 89% over in all of our ecological indicators. And I think even just that is useful because many think that California, being one of the largest economies in the world, I think it's the fifth largest economy in the world, people see it as good. Again, like progressive or healthy or doing well. And we, in doing this research, found no, we're not. And that's not even to consider what is kind of the next layer, which is not only is how is California doing at meeting the human needs within our state and within the ecological needs of our state, but how are we impacting social the ability for people to meet their needs outside of our state, and how are we impacting the health of our planet worldwide? You know, that's a different exercise, but we also think about that as well. And you can imagine, just take, for example, lithium mining in Latin and South America, right? You know, how much California is drawing from the global south and harming ecosystems around the world. Or, you know, supply chains and labor conditions that we're leaning on around the world as well. So we did that. We're also doing an educational campaign, so just really sharing about Doughnut economics. We're going into universities, we're talking to business school students as well as economic students, high school students as well, and then also we're creating pilots. So different communities like San Diego, San Jose, and now Placerville, California, we're saying, hey, how might you bring the donut to life? And they come about in different ways, but same thing. Like, how do you enliven the donut where you are? And how do you work on changing the goal of local economies from growth to happiness and health for well-being of the people there and their ecosystems? So we're also doing that work. So it's a few different things that we're doing, but I would say those are some of the ways that we're bringing donut economics to life in California.
This all is part of your garden, right? All the work that you do, like the podcast, the upstream podcast. How do you stay? Because it sounds like you're doing a lot
Mm.
from me, from the outside, right? You really are doing a lot. How do you stay, you know, I, I want to say balance, but I don't think it's really a good word. How do you stay well? Maybe that's a good word. How do you stay well?
Yeah. Well, one thing, instead of balance, like seeking balance, I seek balancing.
Hmm.
So I will notice, when am I sitting for too long, or a little one too many Zoom calls, or too much in the head realm and not much in the heart or the body or the hands realm. Or when am I thinking on the global scale and I haven't been helping or serving anything in my local community, right? So I think about it as like balancing and just different feedback loops that are really helpful in terms of information. I also would say that idea of, you know, we are attentive to what we measure. That's a quote from Dr. Havinto, the program director of the Gross National Happiness Center. Like, what are my metrics of success? So one of the things that I think about is, one of my metrics of success is getting 10,000 steps in a day. Like, that is part of a good day. There is other indicators of that, but that's one. And so again, if there's a day where I'm online too much or working too much and I haven't gone outside at all, or I haven't gone for any walks and I have like 2,000 steps, that's not a good day, right? So again, it's that feedback loop and that balancing for what comes the next day. I also do feel that a spiritual practice is really helpful in grounding. So I do meditate and journal. I have a coach. I love Five Rhythms dance, which is a dance modality, and having hobbies. So I'm on a bowling team. And I know you referee soccer, so you might appreciate that. But just having some things that are like purely for the joy. You know, they're not actually productive in the classic sense. Although one thing I did think about recently was I do find that some of the work that I do, I also kind of feel like it's a hobby, in the way that like I would read the book about it on the weekend or on vacation or in the evening. Like, I would offer a workshop on something on the weekend. Again, like, I don't feel a resentment towards it because I actually really love doing it. And because Donut Economics, the California Donut Economics Coalition, we're 100% volunteers right now. And so, like, yeah, I actually kind of see that as a hobby. And I think that was like a helpful reframe, because then I can approach it with a more playful, lightness, joyful attitude rather than, oh, like I'm so burdened with work. you know, seeing there are things that I do that bring financial abundance, but then there's also things that I do that are more like hobbies or, I'm part of a team and I really enjoy that aspect of it.
Um, the podcast episodes are pretty long often in your upstream podcast. Um, you do have your Patreon subscribers, people who are part of your community that pay like a monthly subscription fee, um, support subscription support. um, this is something I'm asking this like because I'm really personally also interested in this. Is this
Yeah.
something that it gives you like extra pressure that you need to do a program because people are waiting for you, or just uh, uh, how does it make you feel?
Mm. Well, something that you told me before we started recording was that you really do the podcast for one reason you do the podcast is for learning, ongoing learning. And I would say that really was why I started the podcast with Robert and why I continue is because I get to learn in an ongoing way. Sometimes I'll get a like a pitch. Somebody will say, "Hey, I wrote this book," or "I really want to talk about this topic." And it's not that I don't think their work is valuable or, powerful or important in this world, but if I don't have a live active inquiry, like if I'm not hungry for learning more about what they're talking about, it doesn't come through in the conversation. It's flat. So being led by inquiry is really important. And fortunately, I have plenty of things still, even after many years of the podcast, that I want to know more about. Like for example, right now I'm doing a series on post-capitalist parenting because I'm going to become a parent, So I really want to talk to parents about how do they parent and how do they parent for the future and how do they deal with having kids during this time. Like I'm so curious about that. So, that's something that I'm asking people about. The pod or the Patreon community, which was just something we started last year, that's been really fun because it for me, the way that I see it is our public facing episodes are often more introductory and often they're just more appropriate for a wider audience, right? And like, for example, I did an interview recently on Marxism 101, right? Like very 101, like fun, engaging with Savannah from All Power Books. And then in our Patreon, we do much more deep dives, right, into different texts or different topics, and they might be more theoretical or technical. Um, and it's helpful. It's like a smaller community that really want to go deeper. And so I find that that's a helpful kind of way to look at it. Um, but I'm just so grateful that people are, willing to support and excited to support. And yeah, that I do feel like we're a part of a larger movement of people who are doing this work to question mainstream economic thinking, to learn more together, right? And also to move into action. We definitely don't want the podcast to stay in the word space and in the theoretical. So we have been having more in-group meetings, like one listener started a coffee club. Another group at Sterling College is doing these events after some of the podcast gatherings. Um, so yeah, that kind of like, how does this then make sense to people's lives and how do they take this and bring it into practice? So that's another thing that's really inspiring to me.
That is beautiful. I don't like the word envy or the feeling of envy, but I kind of like feel like, oh, this is something I could really aspire to creating. But my listenership is a lot smaller, and it probably has to do also with that the fact that I'm doing it in Dutch most of my episodes, which is
Mm.
a lot smaller audience, which is okay. I'm okay with that. I'm happy with that. Does this now mean that this is a large part of your income, what you get from Patreon for your podcast?
Less myself than my podcast co-host. Because I don't do the editing and those kind of things. So it is a part of my income. But I do also have these other ways that I engage, like teaching or consulting or coaching, which I see as very complementary plants in my
Mm.
livelihood garden. So, for example, somebody might listen to a podcast episode and then reach out for a right livelihood coaching. And I love that because the right livelihood coaching is like, how do we make sense of these theories and concepts, for example, from the podcast, but in your life? You know, so it is a part of my income, but it's also like helpful for that balancing of my ecosystem.
Beautiful. What have you learned so far from post-capitalism parenting, that you think, okay, this is what I'm really going to use in my when I have my child, when I get my child? I'm not sure how to know how to call this.
Yeah. So I've had two conversations so far, and they've been both really beautiful. And I think one of the main questions is like, is it unethical to have children in this time, right? Like with what we're facing in terms of the climate and political insecurity, particularly in the US. And I think the main thing that keeps coming up is quite the opposite, where
Mm.
um, parenting and supporting children is actually quite a beautiful thing and a precious thing and important for ongoing civilization. Um, for example, there's a beautiful quote from uh, it's called "100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Only Getting Worse" by Michael Ventura, and he says, if nothing else, to leave your children with a sense of love, to pass on whatever qualities and attributes that you'd like to see continue, and I know being a good ancestor is something important to you as well, Erno, and I know you're a parent as well. So there are many ways we can be a good ancestor. You don't have to be a parent to do that. But this feels like a quite obvious way. So I got to ask Brett O'Shea of Revolutionary Left podcast, how do we raise revolutionaries? You know, I love that question. And yeah, so just exploring that, like how might I raise a child to be their own autonomous being, interested in what they're curious about and supporting their interests, endeavors, and needs, and also to be comfortable with the grief of the system and the anger of the system and aware of that kind of liberation psychology of how the systemic changes that are needed, we could impact those to really shift things for the better and that they could see themselves in that. So I think the how will come through practice, but for now I am feeling inspired and excited about being a parent.
I have been reading a couple of books of Roman Krasniqi, which is the partner husband of Kate Raworth, and the interesting part is where he talks about like in the book about being a good ancestor, but also his new book which talks about history and learning from the past of of the problems that we have today, how we could see how we could do things differently. But also he talks about like being part of Extinction Rebellion and like for example, giving their votes to their two sons so that they tell them what party or what person they should vote for. So what I've learned from this is how parenting can be different, how you can involve your child in, like you say, bringing them up like activists, being very aware. And that's something I could have done better with my children. Um, I have I have been talking about this a couple of times on the podcast. Is my daughter? She works in healthcare, so she's a nurse. And my daughter, he works in finance. He works with a bank. He's checking loans for small businesses. And and I love them, of course, both. That's not the thing. But what I think it's the unfairness of the world is how we've created this, right? So that a woman who's in healthcare makes automatically less money than the men in finance, right? So and when we look at pandemic, for example, of what job was the most important for us as a society, as humanity, is people in healthcare or other kind of like similar jobs that they were in. And still, we don't pay them enough, like people, like teachers, right? So when women get into like a certain kind of job, in general, the pay goes down, which is completely strange and unfair. And so to me, I think is also a part for me why equality is such an important thing to me. It's not just looking from the Western world to the Southern Hemisphere, but it's also just in our Western world how equal things are. Which we don't even see, right? You're in California. There's a lot of people who live on the streets who don't can't afford a house, or we have the same issues here in the Netherlands. And these are people that we tend to ignore, that we don't see because they kind of look like us and they don't look like they don't have a house, but they do. They live in a tent or they live somewhere else on a bench, or and so I'm not sure where I'm going with this. The difficulty is for me is the part is how do I transfer these ideas to my children? How do I make it visible to them? And I find that a very difficult topic. That's why I'm bringing this up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first, to respond to something you said about, equality, I just want to share The Spirit Level, like another great book by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, two epidemiologists. They were the two who really helped me understand about inequality and how inequality hurts everyone. I think, as you said, how do we share this with people who may not agree? Saying that a more equal world is better for everyone, right? Less violence, more inclusion, more belonging, more cohesion, better for the environment. It's just like a win, 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 win. And then also they talk about the how, that it's not actually about taxing people progressively so that people come out after taxation with equal money, but it's about paying people more equally to begin with. That's how we create equality. And like inequality was one of the things that kicked me off the cushion into a path of spiritual activism, because I was working as a rape crisis counselor in Silicon Valley. So I was supporting survivors of sexual violence, making very little money and having ever dwindling funding that we had to compete for. Meanwhile, we were amongst some of the biggest tech companies in the world. So I was like, what is this? So I think valuing labor equally, including care work, right? But valuing labor equally within an organization or business and across industries, across the economy. I think that's incredibly important. And I'll just bring in worker cooperative or horizontal decision making, having the actual company or organization decide the pay differential is part of what would make for a more equal economy. People decide, when they decide together how much pay differential they're okay with, they typically decide no greater than 1 to 10 differential. Whereas on the, bigger picture, we have horrendous differentials. In the US, I believe the average is 1 to 365, right? So it's quite crazy. So I just wanted to respond to that a little bit. But then, talking about how do we impart this element of it. One thing that I love to ask people in our Right Livelihood coaching sessions is connected with this quote of Frederick Buechner, which the quote is, "We are called to the place where the world's deepest hunger meets our deepest gladness." And so I ask people, what is the world's deepest hunger as it shows up for you? Meaning, what breaks your heart? What concerns you? And then how do we pair that with your deepest gladness? So what brings you joy or a sense of thriving or a sense of flow? And so I might guess that your children would have an answer to that. What
Mm,
is the world's
mm,
deepest hunger for them, and what brings them a sense of joy or gladness? And perhaps it is working in a hospital or even, supporting small businesses. It might be. But often people can have a heartbreak around something they're experiencing. So perhaps, what if your daughter was experiencing, why is the money that she's making different than her brother or different than these other, systems? And that sense of heartbreak can lead to plants in their livelihood garden. So it's like, what movement or effort or activism might shift that. And it might not be a paying plant, meaning she may do her work in the healthcare system to make money, to meet her needs, that enoughness, but there may be some endeavor some cause, some volunteering, some, support to try to change these larger systems. And I love that. I love that we don't, like all of our art or activism doesn't have to make money, but it can serve this purpose of finding this place where the world's deepest hunger is showing up for us and how that meets our deepest sense of gladness. So that's something I might offer like to explore when we have someone in our life who's kind of maybe just going around business as usual. I would ask like, what is it that's happening in the world that's breaking your heart, you know? And what is it that brings you joy? And where is the kind of the merger or the overlap between those two?
That's beautiful questions. Thank you, Della. Um, there's another thing I want to go back to was the Buddhist economics. I was talking with a friend who is also in the space of post growth entrepreneurship, and we were talking about the idea how we could make the link with Christianity and a post growth world. If you look at Christianity, I think in a lot of, well, she was telling me this, but I believe the same thing, and I think it came also up in several books that you also already mentioned is like the 10% rule, right? So that you give like 10% of your income to the people in need. That is something that is ingrained in a lot of faiths, right? So
Mhm.
although we don't practice that anymore, well, not we, I think most people don't practice that anymore. And even if we could do that, like you said, by starting off with paying fairly, that's a good start. But also, if the money that you make, you can always give like 10% away to people who are more in need than you are. And I think it would be interesting to see how we could bring that back into communities, that part where we care about other people in our environment, but also just even if they're not close to you, because a lot of products that are produced today in the world are just produced somewhere else and we don't see what's going on there, right? But we do know now, because there's been a lot of pictures out there already, that we do know that a lot of people are exploited, are really working under bad circumstances, don't make a lot of money because we want our products very cheap, that we could help like with this rule, the 10% rule. So do you see anywhere a connection between like the Buddhist economy and like donut economy ideas?
And Christianity. Um,
Yes.
Yeah, so, what comes to mind when you say the practice of, I think it's called tithing, right?
Ah,
So,
okay.
yeah, what comes to mind is that not-for-profit business model that we talked about earlier, but on the individual level, right? So if, again, if you have a sense of enoughness and then you make more than that, or you have excess, can you give it away? Right? And that could be material things, that could even be food. I mean, there's people who have um, community fridges in their community, right? Or ways that they can donate. There's a lot of like free Facebook groups, right? Like where it's like give away what you don't need, like keep it circulating. Share shops is another thing where you have a library of things, right? So how can we give away, share, and also tithe, right? So give financially as well. I think that's a beautiful practice, and it doesn't need to be inherently connected with Christianity.
Hmm.
When I tap into Christianity, though, because I think that's a really interesting topic, I find that there are ways that Christianity has been supportive of capitalism and colonization and harm for people on the planet. Again, and we don't have to look very far when we look into like indigenous communities and cultures. I mean, I'm in California, which had so many missions, right? Which really exterminated and really caused so much harm to indigenous peoples here. Um, and we can also find places where Christianity has been supportive of post-capitalist realities. So, for example, tithing that you mentioned. There's also just the story of Jesus kicking out the moneylenders, right? This kind of idea of being against usury, usury as a sin, kind of extreme interest lending, which we find in other traditions, such as in Islamic banking. Interest is illegal. So there's a connection, and that's inherently post-growth to not have that interest mechanism, right? Because that's connected with the growth mechanism. Um, but you also can have liberation theology, that movement coming out of Latin and South America, where actually priests and Christian tradition was very supportive of the poor, the working class, those who were suffering, and really actually helping folks in the anti-colonization and the decolonization and the liberation of peoples. So there's that strand of Christianity as well. But what I would say is the most helpful thing that I found when we zoom out from Christianity, we look at religions or spiritual traditions. Um, and this comes from someone named Lou Royal, and he wrote about uh, spiritual traditions are unhelpful when they posit individual salvation and cosmic duality. Okay? And they're helpful when they posit collective liberation and cosmic unity. And I'm going to explain what that means. Individual salvation is where a religion or a faith or a tradition, a spiritual tradition, encourages you to think about yourself, that small sense of self, that egoic sense of self. My individual salvation is what is most important. I'm getting to heaven or leaving the wheel of samsara or, right, like it's very individual. The mindfulness that I talked about, that's individual salvation. And we can find that expression in all traditions, in Islam and Christianity, in all the traditions, in Buddhism. Then what's helpful, the antidote to that is collective liberation. And again, we can find that in all the traditions, such as liberation theology or the idea of the eco-sattva in Buddhism is like the liberation of all beings, right? So that going from individual salvation to collective liberation. And then that second piece is about, do you see the world as cosmic duality or cosmic unity? And what that means, cosmic duality is there's this world and then there's another world that's separate from and that's better than. And it's essentially saying that this world, this earth, this material realm is not sacred or special or important. We can treat it poorly because there's this other, there's this cosmic duality, there's this escaping the wheel of samsara or a heaven, right? But if we see cosmic unity, that's a sense of everything is sacred. Like this earth is sacred, the water is sacred, right? In indigenous tradition, we'd say, like, nature is kin, right? All my relations. So I love that because it doesn't demonize any particular religion. It says that in each religion, in each tradition, there's these expressions of both. And I like to lean into what are the expressions that really have that collective liberation and cosmic unity. That's what's useful to the well-being of ourselves and the planet and of future generations.
You, what I like about you and this conversation is how you every time make sure that we see like different views on the same topic. So it's not you're not saying this is the right thing. You're looking from various perspectives to the same topic, and I think it's really interesting to see that. Um, so like the part you just mentioned with heaven, right? I'm a Christian, Catholic. Well, I don't go to church, but that was how I was raised. But so heaven was something that was part of that story in church, as I could say it. I've never saw it the way you just described, right? So that because you can do now in life what you want, and then you go to a better place, heaven. I really like that part. It really teach me something today. So that's really great. So thank you. Um, I think I'm looking. I think I have. Well, I could ask you tons of more questions, but I think we've covered like a lot of things. Um, yeah, I think I have no more. Is there something you want to add? You want to say that you didn't think of, something you want to add?
Hmm. Yeah, maybe to just close with our invitations going forth for the listeners. And I'd love to ask you, Erno, after what you're taking with you as you go forth and anything you'd like to invite for folks. So to kind of summarize, and really beautiful conversation. Thank you for your questions and for having me on. I would invite folks to contemplate your metrics in your life. You know, what is most important to you and how are you measuring success in your own life? For anyone who is a part of a business or organization, I would also invite you to do the same. You know, what is most important? What is the health or the well-being or the progress of your business or your organization? And if you are someone whose entrepreneurship or business is creating profit, I would invite you to explore enoughness and to then redirect that profit towards a cause that you care about. Where's the world's deepest hunger showing up for you? And how can your business actually support that contribution? And again, if you want to know more about that, Jennifer Hinton's work and even transitioning to a, post-profit business or a not-for-profit business is what Jennifer Hinton would call it. Um, I also heard us just talk about general sense of enoughness and exploring that in our own lives. And so on the individual level, if tithing is possible or giving away that which we don't need, and that feels important. Checking out Doughnut Economics, whether it's the book, if you haven't read that yet, I really recommend that as a great place for doing some unlearning around mainstream economic thinking, as well as joining the Doughnut Economics Action Lab to perhaps see who else is in your area who might be doing this work. And yeah, I think I'd say by way of connecting with me, if anyone wants to listen to the podcast, the Upstream podcast, we're on all the platforms and perhaps join the Patreon community or to just connect with me on social media because I do feel that we're a part of a movement. And so I'd love to hear from you how this conversation landed and just what you're learning about and exploring. And yeah, I think to close, just to invite in again that question of like, we're called to the place where the world's deepest hunger meets our deepest joy or gladness. So just an invitation to just ask yourself that today. Maybe take that on a walk, invite a friend to share that with, maybe journal about it, and then bring that into some gardening to your livelihood garden. How does it connect with that? And if it doesn't, how might you invite that in or plant a new seed that might relate? So that's where I would close. But Erno, what about you? Any closing reflections or invitations for folks listening?
I think you've mentioned everything that I had in my mind. um, I've really enjoyed the questions you mentioned. What's the hunger in the world? What's the pain that you're having, and what's the joy? And so, and where are they crossing? What's the point that you can find them? Um, yeah, I think I really liked how you, like I just mentioned before, how you look at the same topic from different perspectives. Um, you, you have this ability to, um, well, bring different points of view on the same topic, so that it it brings me along. It brings me along on the story that you want to share today. Um, and I think the thing that you started with your garden with uh, like kind of like buckets, right? So to me, like buckets that you do, like your podcast, but also the work that you do for money, for a living, the work with your mom, your expectancy, so, the work with the donut economy, which is like a hobby. And so how you have this like imbalancing in a way that um yeah, you always feel well and don't feel overwhelmed with the work that's coming towards you, and which I think is I can understand that is a pretty tough thing to do when you have so many people listening to your podcast, or when you become more visible, that more people will be coming to you and somehow feeling still in a way that you can find your own balance I think that's interesting to discover and to find out how you can do this in your life. Yes. So you asked the questions for the audience, what they can think about. I think that was plenty of questions for the people that are listening now. That I don't want to add another question for them. For me, it was beautiful. It really was. I was not sure where we were going to go. I didn't want to have like similar questions that I've already heard from all the other episodes. Um, uh, and so I kind of like try to find a way to make it like go in a way that we together came on like this flow. And yeah, I think I'm really happy. So I'm really glad we had this conversation, and I thank you for that and for sharing your expertise, your knowledge, but also your wisdom in the broader sense, and your time. Della, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be in conversation with you.